Over the course of the year 1917, Russia was embroiled in a political and social revolution which saw the existing Tsar-run government overthrown in favor of a socialist system. As with any revolution, the exact causes for the Russian Revolution are not simple to pin down and essentially consist of numerous socio-political issues which were far-reaching in depth and scope. However, at the root of that complex foundation for revolution was one single issue: status. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, status is defined as, quote, position or rank in relation to others, end quote. With this definition in mind, this video will focus specifically on the relations between classes that existed throughout the Russian Revolution. Over the course of the Russian Revolution, differences in status between various groups, including social classes, genders, and age groups, served as the primary driving force of change. When examining the role that status played in the events leading up to and throughout the revolution, the vast disparity which existed between social and economic classes at the time served as the foremost foundational issue for the revolution itself. Prior to the events of 1917, Russia was a monarchy which was led by a czar. Essentially, social status in Russian society before the revolution was extremely rigid and determined an individual's opportunities for success. Under the rule of the czars, the divisions among social classes were stark, with wealth concentrated largely within the upper class. At the same time, rising prices and a lack of food devastated the peasantry and the proletariat. When the revolution first began, the primary cause was that the peasantry and the proletariat were simply fed up with the conditions they were forced to endure and chose to protest that fact. Reasonably, those protests could have been crushed by the military, but they were not. One of the main reasons for the revolution's success was the fact that the soldiers turned against the government. Why? Because many of the soldiers came from the same social classes as those championing the revolution. As the revolution progressed and became organized, the socialist ideals it represented included redistribution of the land amongst the peasantry and return of control to the working class. In short, its purpose was to redefine status in Russian society. Truly, the Russian Revolution was led from the bottom up, as the social classes which held virtually no status traditionally rose up to equalize their status and diminish the line separating classes. Similarly, the difference in status granted to men and women during the period leading up to the revolution, and the tension that status difference created, also offers a lens for understanding the events that occurred. Before 1917, women and men were not granted equal rights. Women were not allowed to vote, and the society was largely patriarchal. On International Women's Day, in February of 1917, thousands of women from the working class stormed the streets of Petrograd to protest. It was this mass protest that ultimately sparked the revolution itself. Eventually, the revolution saw women given the right to vote, among other freedoms, which served to lessen the gap in status between men and women. As with social classes in Russian society, the disparity in gender-related status was lessened, giving power back to those from whom it had been previously withheld. Finally, the revolution began to wind down, having achieved a large-scale redistribution of status. During this time, the status afforded to young and old generations underwent a great shift as the revolutionaries strove to educate society on socialist ideals. Prior to the events of the revolution, Russian youth were not given much thought, and those born into the proletariat were often doomed to illiteracy and a lack of formal education. However, the ideological shifts brought on by the Bolshevik rise to power saw young generations become the center of political action. Not only were the youth suddenly given a voice, they became the most highly valued members of Russian society for powerful officials promoting the spread of socialism. For instance, propaganda and literature of the time directly targeted Russian youth. Education of the children of all social classes also became a top priority. At the extreme end of the shift in status towards younger generations, 1918 saw the creation of the Komsomol, a political league intended for the youth to learn and eventually embody the ideals of the new government. The members of the Komsomol were viewed as the future of the nation and were set apart and elevated in status. At the same time, older generations became increasingly marginalized, the status they once had gradually slipping away. Although status differences among social classes served as one of the foundations of the revolution, the shift in status among age groups shortly afterwards would serve to maintain the revolutionary ideals far into the future. In conclusion, the principal issue behind much of the change that the Russian Revolution strove for was status, specifically the differences in status afforded to various groups. Before and during the revolution, the disparity that existed between social and economic classes served as a rallying cry for change. However, it was the difference in status among genders which ultimately kickstarted the revolution in February of 1917. Eventually, variations in status afforded to young versus old generations came to define the era during the years shortly after the revolution. Interestingly, those with the least status in Russian society were the ones who led the revolution, which essentially represented a shift in status towards traditionally marginalized groups. Clearly, the idea of status can serve as a powerful driving force for change, and it continues to do so, even today.